Hello and welcome to this lecture on the French Revolution. I'm going to give this lecture in three parts. First part, I'm going to outline the background to and the events of the French Revolution. And apart from maybe one or two key events and dates, like start of the uprising, execution of the king possibly, you don't really need to make any notes on this. And you'll not need to write on these events in your exam. It's not a history exam. But you should still watch this first section. It is, in my view, essential background for making sense of the ideologies we study and why they emerged when they did. And plus, it's just a great story. In the second part, I'll look at the significance and enduring legacy of the French Revolution. In other words, what changes it brought about and why these were important. And in the third and final section, I'll look at how conservatism and socialism both really emerged as responses to the French Revolution. The one as a reaction against it, and the other as a desire to extend and deepen it and more fully realize its promise of liberty, equality and fraternity. So to begin with a bit of background on the economic and political conditions in France on the eve of the revolution. France still had many elements of feudalism in place in the 1780s, and the country was divided for political purposes into three so-called estates, three groups of people that is, each of which had a different political and legal status. The first two estates, the clergy and the nobility, were the most privileged and were exempt from paying any taxes. Now this left the tax burden entirely on the third estate, which comprised, you guessed it, everyone else. Merchants, traders, artisans, workers, peasants, literally everyone except the monks, priests and lords. Now this crippling tax burden and the perceived unfairness of the lords and clergy being exempt from it was one of the causes of the resentment that burst out in 1789 with the start of the revolution. Another cause of this resentment was the corvée, the compulsory unpaid labour duties that lords were entitled to demand from their peasants. This could include help with the lord's harvest, the clearing of wasteland, the building of roads. Really anything that the lord needed doing on his land could be demanded of the peasants. And Mark Steele's excellent book, Vive la Révolution, he notes that in one place this duty included staying up all night to swish frogs away from the Lord's pond so that their croaking did not keep him awake. So being forced to perform such duties unpaid was obviously another source of resentment. And a third cause of resentment was the lack of popular representation. In theory, each of the three estates could elect representatives to the Estates General, which was effectively France's equivalent of Parliament, to be consulted by the king on matters of state policy. But the Estates General was not a permanent body. It met only when the king commanded it to meet, and no king had done so for 175 years by the time we reached 1789. So there was a growing anger at the abuse of monarchical power that seemed to exist in France. King Louis XVI effectively ruled as an absolute ruler, that is, one with no constraints on his power, which he used to exact oppressive taxes without the people's consent, to order arbitrary arrest and imprisonments, and to stifle freedom of expression. But the trigger for the revolution was in fact a sudden burst of inflation in 1789. Food prices doubled, leading to a real danger of starvation amongst many people. In response, riots broke out and bakeries were looted. Now, the king called an Estates General at this point to help him deal with his problems. He was also running out of money. But when the Estates General met, the third estate were not allowed to come in through the main door. They had to go kind of round the back because they were too common and so on. And this really was symbolic of the contempt with which the king seemed to treat the ordinary people. He seemed to have no interest in hearing their grievances. And then on a political level, the third estate were constantly outvoted by the first and second estate who supported the king. Each of the three estates kind of had equal powers. So if the first two estates kind of joined forces, they could always outvote the third, even though the third estate constituted the vast majority of the population. Over 90% of the population were in the third estate, but they were still outvoted by the others. So the third estate decided to meet separately in the nearby royal tennis court, indoor tennis court. they declared themselves the National Assembly. They said, we're the genuine representatives of the nation. And they swore an oath to stay together until they had changed how France was governed. Now, the king tried but failed to have them removed, and eventually he agreed to form a new assembly in which they would be the majority. But the king, at the same time as doing this, making these concessions, he was also raising a royal army to defeat them. When news of this got out, because he was obviously trying to do it secretly, a crowd gathered and seized 30,000 muskets from the royal armoury, and then stormed the Bastille prison to seize its ammunition. This was on the 14th of July 1789, which is to this day a national holiday in France, very key event marking the start of the armed uprising against the king, marking the start, in other words, really of the revolution, the storming of the Bastille. You can Google it, see the famous painting of the event and so on, if you want. So when news of this then reached the countryside, the peasants joined in this rebellion. Now, the National Assembly sought to restore order by drafting new laws to abolish feudalism and turn France into a constitutional monarchy. They thought this would meet their demands, and it was also, they hoped, pacify the uprisen peasants and so on and so forth. But the king would hear none of it. So on the 4th of October, a mob, mainly of women, remember this was the mob that so worried and terrified Edmund Burke, marched to the Versailles Palace and attempted to storm it. And the palace had to be protected by the National Guard that was organised by the Assembly. So this is a significant moment, because now you have the king is dependent. He wants to close down the National Assembly, or at least he initially did, but now he's dependent on it for his own protection against the masses. So tricky situation for the king. He's now basically dependent on an assembly he doesn't really want to exist. The next day, a procession of 2,000 coaches made up of the royal family, his courtiers and members of the National Assembly drove into Paris, bringing bread and flour to the hungry citizens. So this seemed like a moment where, well, it seemed like maybe the revolution was over. The king had heard people's grievances. He joined forces with the National Assembly. He's distributing food to the people. And in fact, people greeted this royal caravan into the city. They tied red, white and blue ribbons to their... So I've lost my place here. They tied red, white and blue ribbons to sticks to wave in the air to welcome the procession. Symbolically, red and blue were the colours of Paris, and white was the colour of the monarchy. So this was a representation of unity between the king and the people. And it became, as I'm sure you know, the national flag of first the revolution and subsequently of France itself ever since. And in fact, this French flag is the origin of all the national flags we have today, really. They began here with the French Revolution. The whole idea of a national flag begun with these crowds tying these red, white and blue ribbons to their branches. And the slogan of the revolution was freedom, equality and brotherhood, or in French, liberté, égalité, fraternité. So at this point, there was an uneasy coexistence, if you like, between the king and the new revolutionary government. France was still a monarchy, but it had effectively become a constitutional monarchy, much like Britain, in which the king remained head of state, but government was in the hands of an elected representative body, the National Assembly. But the people still did not entirely trust the king, and were worried that he might seek to ally with other European powers to overthrow the new revolutionary government and restore his absolute rule. So, because they didn't trust them, the royal family were forced to stay in Paris, where the revolutionaries could keep an eye on them. And they were banned from leaving the country, where they might try to raise a foreign army to restore their power. So this is this strange situation now, where you still have the king, like I say, uneasy coexistence, really, between the king and the National Assembly. He's still the head of state, but the National Assembly are kind of have him under house arrest, if you like, not allowing him to leave Paris, lest he join forces with other European countries to try to overthrow them. But in 1791, the royal family sought to escape and to Austria, in fact, where the Queen's brother was emperor. And they might have made it if not for their vanity. Rather than sneaking out dressed in peasant rags where they might have got out unnoticed, they, of course, as these people do. They went off, insist on going off in their royal coach, with lots of other royal coaches bringing their luggage, their emblem on the side and so on. And so, of course, they didn't get very far before they were spotted and brought back to Paris. Now, at this time, the revolutionaries were divided into two broad camps. The moderates, known as the Girondists, who sought a constitutional monarchy, kind of modelled on, if you like, the 1688 Glorious Revolution, something like that. And the radicals, known as the Jacobins, who wanted a republic with no monarchy at all, more like the sort of Cromwellian type of faction, the sort of parliamentarian side and the Civil War radical side. And in fact, really, the Jacobins, probably much more radical than Cromwell, in fact, and can in many ways be seen as the sort of origins of the kind of 19th century socialist movement in many ways. The Jacobin support largely came from amongst the most fervent of the Parisian revolutionaries, known as the Sansculottes, who are effectively the Parisian proletariat. The word Sansculotte means literally without breeches. They hated the nobility and the way they dressed, and so they refused to wear breeches buckled at the knee as the nobles did, and instead wore long trousers, kind of like jeans, hence their nickname. So, in 1791, the new constitution was drawn up, which abolished nobility, inherited titles and privileges, and from now on, it commanded that all will be subject to the same laws. There will be no exemptions due to social status. So there were no longer these three estates, only some of whom had to pay taxes, only some of whom certain political privileges accrued to, and so on. So you can see this was very much a liberal revolution, implementing the ideals of liberalism and eradicating the remnants of feudalism. And of course, what they're doing, they're implementing this idea of equality under the law, is what they were doing with those measures. And they put into place many other progressive measures. For example, slavery was abolished throughout the French Empire, making the French revolutionaries the first European rulers to abolish it. It should be noted here that the Haitian Revolution, this was not entirely, their own, just something they dreamed up would be a good moral thing to do. What was happening in Haiti is that the Haitian Revolution had already begun, in which the enslaved Africans in the French colony of Haiti, in the Caribbean, rose up to overthrow slavery themselves. And therefore, the new French government realized that if they wanted to keep Haiti as part of the French Empire, which they certainly did, as Haiti was the most profitable colony in the world at that time, they would have to commit to abolishing slavery to win the support of the Haitians. In 1792, universal male suffrage was introduced for the first time anywhere in Europe. This was 126 years before it was introduced in the UK, for example. But still, people were very worried about the danger of foreign monarchs invading the country to overthrow their revolution. Wealthy people and army officers opposed to the revolution had fled the country and did indeed start plotting with neighbouring powers to invade France and put an end to the revolution. So the people began to demand action against these intrigues. And so in April 1792, France went to war against Austria and Prussia, Prussia being the largest of the Germanic states, which later went on to join together to form Germany, and one of the most conservative, and was particularly hostile to the revolution. Meanwhile, fears grew that the king was working with these enemy powers to overthrow the revolutionary government. And the royal family were now moved to a fortress and kept as prisoners. The radicals were now in the ascendancy in the National Assembly, and they voted to abolish the monarchy. So, on the 22nd of 1792, King Louis XVI simply became Louis Capet, an ordinary citizen with no higher status or power than anyone else. It was a new era. Even a new calendar was introduced, a more supposedly rational one, showing the influence of Enlightenment rationalism. The new calendar would be 12 months, as we have now, but each month of exactly 30 days each, and each month containing 3 10-day weeks. The 5 leftover days would become festivals or public holidays, with the spare day on each leap year every 4 years, a celebration of the revolution. But this new calendar was unpopular. You can probably guess why. People were used to having it, that those days a weekend was only 1 day. You'd work for 6 days and have 1 day off a week. Now they only had 1 day off every 10. 1 day off a week meant only a day off every 10 days instead of every 7. And Christmas was gone with this new calendar. It was and also religion itself was abolished. So very radical measures were being implemented now at this point in the French Revolution. Then, in late 1792, an iron box was discovered in the room in which Louis had been staying, former King Louis had been staying, and it contained letters proving that he had indeed been plotting with foreign powers to overthrow the assembly, as people had always feared and suspected. So, in December 1792, he was put on trial and condemned to death, and the following month, in January 1793, he was publicly guillotined. He had tried to make a speech before his head was chopped off, but the drummers drowned out his words. And the following October, his wife, Marie Antoinette, was also executed. So, 1793, France is in disarray. It was being invaded on all fronts by Spain, England, and Austria. It was also facing rebellions against the revolution, and in some cases, the local population was actually welcoming the invaders. So this prompted the government to set up the revolutionary committees to deal with traitors. These committees worked as judge, jury, and executioner against those suspected of plotting against the revolution. People would report anyone they suspected of treachery to their nearest committee, and thousands were executed on suspicion of treachery, working to overthrow the revolution, colluding with foreign powers, etc. It sounds very brutal, and it was, but the revolutionaries were genuinely concerned, and with good reason, that if the revolution was overthrown, they themselves would then be put to death. They believed, therefore, as literally a situation of kill or be killed. Now, this period of Jacobin rule in 1793 and 1794 became known as the Terror because of the large number of executions. Over 2,000 were executed in Paris alone. And eventually, the foreign invasions were defeated, and therefore the need for the Terror subsided. At the end of this, Robespierre, the head of the Jacobins, himself was arrested by one of these revolutionary committees. He tried to shoot himself, but a soldier dashed away his pistol, breaking his jaw. He was carried away on a plank and put on trial by his own revolutionary committee and condemned to death and executed the next day. And by the end of the Terror, almost every leading figure in the revolution had been killed, as I say, including even the head of the Jacobins himself, Robespierre. As Mark Steele has pointed out, quote, "The only significant character who seems to have made it through from beginning to end unscathed was Sanon, the official guillotiner." Now, following Robespierre's execution, the radical Jacobin faction lost power to the so-called moderates, the Girondists, and then following them you had Napoleon. Disorder and confusion continued until Napoleon took over and imposed military rule in 1799, declaring himself emperor no less in 1804. This declaration disappointed many of his supporters who'd seen him as a republican hero, an anti-monarchical hero. For example, Beethoven in Germany, a big fan of Napoleon, just dedicated a symphony to Napoleon, and when he heard that Napoleon declared himself emperor, he ran to the printers and scratched out his dedication with such fury that his symphony was ripped to shreds. But Napoleon continued to pay respects to at least the ideal of popular sovereignty ruled by the people, and each of the steps he took to concentrate power in his hands was indeed legitimized by a popular plebiscite, what we today call a referendum. Napoleon reversed many of the earlier, more radical parts of the revolution, such as the new calendar, and he also reintroduced Catholicism, saying that no country can be well governed without the aid of religion. In particular, he thought it was necessary in order to maintain social inequality. There's a quote from Napoleon, very revealing. He says, "When a man dies of hunger next to another who is gorged, he cannot accept that disparity without someone in authority saying, 'God has decreed there must be rich and poor, but in the afterlife, for eternity, it will be the other way round.'" He reintroduced slavery in the French colonies even, did Napoleon. Nevertheless, Napoleon continued to spread the revolutionary ideals of constitutionalism and republicanism across Europe with his armies, often to the delight of many of those living in the countries he invaded. Hegel, for example, the German philosopher, went out to join the crowd cheering on Napoleon's arrival in Prussia, only to find when he returned home that Napoleon's troops had burned his house down. Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815 in the Battle of Waterloo in Belgium by the combined forces of Britain and Prussia after almost the whole rest of Europe had declared war against him. and then the king's brother, Louis XVIII, was restored to power. So those are the events of the revolution and the Napoleonic wars that followed between 1789 and 1815. Now you might think, well, what was the point of all of that? You know, they ended up just with a king being restored to power, revolutionaries defeated. What a waste of time. In the next part of this lecture, I will argue that this is not the case. Okay.